Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, you're not just listening to history, you're drifting through the quiet paths of power as the world slowly falls asleep. Tonight, we'll move gently across time from the whispered intelligence of Queen Cleopatra to the silent strength of women who held entire bloodlines together. From candlelit banquets where power was carefully performed, to a wall so vast it taught the world how authority becomes landscape. This is not a story of battles or noise, it's a story of power that moved softly, patiently, until it no longer needed to move at all. So before you get comfortable, take a gentle moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if these deep sleep history stories help you find peace, sleep better, or simply reflect on our shared journey through time. Now, close your eyes, let your breathing slow, feel the day begin to loosen its grip. And as the night grows quiet, allow history to move softly around you. One whisper, one ritual, one unbroken line, guiding you gently toward rest. Most people think they know Cleopatra. They picture a woman of overwhelming beauty, dramatic eyeliner, golden crowns, and effortless charm. A queen who conquered hearts the way armies conquer land. But the real Cleopatra was far stranger than that image. Quieter, more calculated, and far more patient than history usually allows her to be. Tonight, we are not meeting the Cleopatra of spectacle. We are meeting her slowly, gently, the way the night prefers, when details soften and truth becomes clearer. Cleopatra was not considered exceptionally beautiful by the standards of her own time. Ancient writers who met her or spoke to those who did rarely praised her physical appearance. What they remembered instead was her presence, the way she spoke, the way she listened, the way she seemed to understand the person in front of her before they realized they were being understood. In a world obsessed with visible power, Cleopatra mastered the invisible kind. She grew up in a palace filled with tension, suspicion, and constant threat. The Ptolemaic court of Egypt was not a place of comfort. It was a place where siblings married for power, where brothers and sisters plotted against one another, and where survival required more than courage. It required precision. From a young age, Cleopatra learned that being loud invited danger, but being observant created advantage. She watched more than she spoke, she waited longer than others dared, and she remembered everything. One of the quiet facts often overlooked is that Cleopatra was among the most educated rulers of the ancient world. She spoke at least 7 languages fluently, including Egyptian, which many rulers before her never bothered to learn. This alone set her apart. When she addressed priests, scholars, traders, or ambassadors, she spoke to them in their own tongue, not as a performance, but as a signal of respect. People felt seen in her presence, and that feeling lingered long after she had left the room. Cleopatra was deeply interested in mathematics, astronomy, and early forms of chemistry. She lived in a world where science and mysticism were intertwined, and she navigated both with ease. While others relied on tradition alone, Cleopatra asked questions. How did the stars move? How did substances change when combined? How could nature be persuaded rather than forced? These were not idle curiosities. Knowledge, to Cleopatra, was a form of leverage. Quiet knowledge was the most powerful kind. Perhaps the strangest and most misunderstood aspect of Cleopatra's power was her relationship with scent. In ancient Egypt, Scent was not cosmetic, it was symbolic. Fragrance marked divinity, authority, and presence. Cleopatra understood this deeply. She used perfumes not to decorate herself, but to shape memory. Long before someone recalled her words, they remembered the atmosphere she created. The air around her carried intention, calm, control, deliberate warmth. There is an old story, recorded by later writers, of Cleopatra dissolving a priceless pearl in vinegar and drinking it during a banquet, simply to prove she could consume a fortune in a single moment. Whether this event happened exactly as described matters less than why the story survived. It captured something true about her. Cleopatra understood spectacle, but she never relied on it alone. Even in moments of drama, there was calculation. Timing mattered more than volume. Impact mattered more than force. When she first met Julius Caesar, Cleopatra did not arrive as a conqueror or a supplicant. She arrived as an idea, smuggled into his presence, wrapped in cloth, revealed at precisely the right moment. This was not romance, it was theater designed with surgical care. Caesar did not simply see Cleopatra, he experienced her entrance, and once experienced, she could not be ignored. Cleopatra did not demand attention, she orchestrated it. What makes these facts truly unusual is not their extravagance, but their restraint. Cleopatra ruled in a time of chaos, yet she moved slowly. She did not rush to dominate. She waited, adjusted, and aligned herself with forces larger than any single person. Her strength was not aggression, but calibration, not noise, but silence, not beauty as decoration, but intelligence as atmosphere. As the night deepens, it becomes easier to understand her. Cleopatra did not conquer Rome with armies. She did it with timing, with silence, with scent. And in doing so, she revealed a form of power that history rarely celebrates, but never forgets. And yet, Cleopatra was not alone. Across history, many women ruled without crowns. They shaped families, kingdoms, and entire eras without standing on thrones or leading legions. Their voices were soft, their names often absent, but their influence was immense. And it is to them that the story gently turns next. As the night settles more deeply around us, Cleopatra begins to feel less like a distant historical figure and more like a presence moving quietly through a dimly lit room. Her power was never sudden. It did not arrive with raised voices or visible force. Instead, it unfolded slowly, the way tides reshape a shoreline without ever announcing themselves. This was the strange genius of Cleopatra's rule. She understood that the most lasting forms of power do not demand attention, they invite it. Cleopatra ruled at a time when Egypt was no longer the unstoppable empire it once had been. Rome was rising, relentless and ambitious, absorbing territories with both diplomacy and steel. Many leaders responded to Rome with panic or aggression. Cleopatra did neither. She studied Rome the way a physician studies a powerful but dangerous medicine, carefully, patiently, with respect for its strength and awareness of its weaknesses. One of the quiet facts often lost in louder retellings is how rarely Cleopatra acted without preparation. She did not rush into alliances. She allowed relationships to mature in their own time. When she aligned herself with Julius Caesar, it was not out of desperation, but out of calculation shaped by long observation. She understood the rhythm of Roman politics, the importance of image, and the fragility of loyalty beneath ambition. By the time she stepped into Caesar's world, she had already learned how it moved. Cleopatra's use of silence was not passive, it was deliberate. In negotiations, she listened longer than others expected. She allowed pauses to stretch. People, uncomfortable with silence, often revealed more than they intended. Cleopatra gathered these fragments calmly, without interruption. Her restraint made others feel powerful in her presence, and that feeling drew them closer. Influence, she understood, grows best when it feels self-chosen. The Roman world was loud. Public speeches echoed through forums. Power was asserted through declaration. Cleopatra's approach was different. She ruled through atmosphere. When she entered a room, conversations softened, attention narrowed. Not because she demanded it, but because her composure created gravity. This was not accident. Cleopatra carefully shaped how she appeared, when she appeared, and just as importantly, when she did not. Even her famed relationships with Roman leaders were governed by patience. Cleopatra did not attempt to dominate Caesar or later Mark Antony. She positioned herself as a stabilizing presence amid chaos. Rome was always in motion, consumed by rivalry and expansion. Egypt under Cleopatra offered something different: continuity, ritual, calm. In a world addicted to conquest, Cleopatra offered steadiness, and that steadiness became irresistible. There is a tendency in history to interpret Cleopatra's story as one of seduction alone. This is a shallow reading. Seduction implies impulse. Cleopatra's actions were methodical. She understood human psychology with remarkable clarity. She knew that people are drawn not to excess, but to balance, not to noise, but to calm confidence. Her restraint was more persuasive than spectacle could ever be. Cleopatra also understood time in a way few rulers did. She was not interested in immediate victory at the cost of long-term survival. Every decision she made was weighed against its future echo. How would this alliance age? How would this gesture be remembered? How would this silence shape tomorrow's conversation? This long view allowed her to move slowly while others rushed forward, often toward their own undoing. As the night continues, it becomes clear that Cleopatra's so-called crazy facts are not expressions of extravagance, but of discipline. Her intelligence was not scattered, it was focused. Her knowledge was not displayed, it was applied. And her power was not enforced, it was felt. In this way, Cleopatra stands as an early architect of what we might now call soft power, influence that works without pressure, authority that does not shout, control that feels like harmony. This is why her story lingers, not as a tale of conquest, but as a study in quiet mastery. And as her presence begins to fade gently into the background of history, it opens space for another truth. Cleopatra's way of ruling was not unique to her alone. Across centuries, many women learned to guide destinies without standing in the spotlight. They ruled through patience, memory, and continuity, and it is toward them that our story slowly drifts next. As the world around Cleopatra slowed into evening, she understood something most rulers never did. Power does not live only in commands or victories. It lives in memory. And memory, once formed, is far more difficult to erase than any law or army. Cleopatra devoted careful attention to this invisible realm, shaping not only what people thought of her, but how they felt when they remembered her. Cleopatra lived in a civilization where ritual was not decoration, but language. In ancient Egypt, rituals structured reality itself. The movement of the sun, the flooding of the Nile, the order of society, All were understood through repeated symbolic acts. Cleopatra absorbed this worldview deeply. She knew that authority did not need to explain itself when it felt inevitable. Ritual made power feel natural. Scent played a central role in this understanding. To modern ears, perfume may sound like indulgence. To Cleopatra, it was architecture. Fragrance could shape a room before words were spoken. It could calm tension, awaken reverence, or signal divinity. Cleopatra's perfumes were carefully blended not for vanity, but for atmosphere. When she entered a space, the air itself announced her presence gently, without demand. Ancient sources describe her ships arriving with scented sails, the wind carrying her before she was even seen. This was not excess, it was anticipation. By the time Cleopatra appeared, people were already attuned to her arrival. Their senses had been prepared, their attentions softened. This was not manipulation in the crude sense, it was orchestration. Cleopatra arranged moments the way musicians arrange silence between notes. One of the most famous stories connected to Cleopatra is the tale of the pearl dissolved in vinegar during a banquet. The image is striking, a queen consuming unimaginable wealth in a single drink. Whether this event occurred exactly as told is less important than what it symbolizes. Cleopatra understood performance as memory-making. The act itself was fleeting, the story endured. Power, she knew, was not only what happened, but what was repeated afterward. Banquets, audiences, and ceremonies under Cleopatra were designed with similar care. They were not chaotic celebrations, they were structured experiences. Guests moved through spaces where light, scent, sound, and timing were controlled. Conversations unfolded at measured pace. Silence was allowed to linger. In these spaces, people did not feel dominated, they felt guided. And guidance creates loyalty far more reliably than fear. Cleopatra's genius was recognizing that people rarely remember facts, but they always remember feelings. They may forget the exact words spoken, but they remember how safe or unsettled they felt, how calm, how elevated. Cleopatra shaped those impressions with precision. Her power settled into the body before it reached the mind. This approach extended even to how she presented herself physically. Cleopatra did not overwhelm with ornament. She balanced restraint and symbolism. Jewelry carried meaning. Colors were chosen deliberately. Gold suggested continuity with divine order. Certain stones evoked protection or fertility. Her appearance was never random, it was a visual language, spoken softly. Time, again, was central. Cleopatra allowed moments to breathe. She did not hurry encounters, she let anticipation grow. In doing so, she reversed the usual hierarchy of power. Others waited for her rhythm, others adjusted their pace. This subtle inversion placed her at the center without ever announcing it. As night deepens, Cleopatra's world begins to feel less dramatic and more meditative. Her reign was not a storm of constant action, it was a long, deliberate composition. Each gesture placed carefully, each pause respected, each memory shaped gently, then released into the world to carry her influence further than any decree could. This is perhaps the strangest fact of all. Cleopatra ruled not by forcing the present, but by shaping the future memory of the present. Long after her voice fell silent, the atmosphere she created continued to speak. This is why her story survives, not as a list of events, but as an enduring sensation. And yet, even this mastery was not isolated. Cleopatra stood within a much older pattern. Across clans, households, and hidden corridors of history, women learned to guide memory, ritual, and continuity without formal authority. They shaped worlds quietly, while others took credit loudly. And it is toward these women, guardians of unseen power, that our story gently prepares to move. As the night grows quieter, Cleopatra's story begins to loosen its grip, not because it weakens, but because it is already settled where it belongs. By now, it is clear that the so-called crazy facts surrounding her life are not curiosities meant to shock. They are clues. Traces left behind by a woman who understood that power, when wielded gently, leaves deeper impressions than force ever could. Cleopatra did not seek to dominate history. She allowed history to absorb her. Cleopatra ruled in a world obsessed with permanence, yet she knew that nothing political is ever permanent. Empires rise and collapse, alliances fracture, and victories fade. What remains, she understood, is pattern, mood, memory. Cleopatra invested her energy not in building monuments of stone, but in shaping human experience. That choice made her influence fragile in the short term, but enduring in the long view. Toward the end of her life, the world around Cleopatra changed rapidly. Rome no longer needed partners, it wanted control. The careful balance she had maintained began to tilt. Yet, even as circumstances tightened, Cleopatra's approach did not harden. She did not abandon her rhythm. She did not become reckless. She continued to act with composure, as though aware that the manner of an ending matters as much as its outcome. History often focuses on the drama of her final days, but in the context of sleep and stillness, a different truth emerges. Cleopatra's true legacy was never her death, it was her method. She demonstrated that leadership could be quiet without being weak, intentional without being aggressive, and influential without being loud. This idea survived her far more successfully than any treaty or title. Cleopatra's Egypt eventually fell under Roman control, but Cleopatra herself was never fully conquered. Her image endured, reshaped again and again by those who needed her to be something specific: a seductress, a villain, a tragic queen. Each version says more about the storyteller than about her. Beneath these layers, however, the original pattern remains intact: a ruler who moved slowly, listened carefully, and shaped reality through atmosphere rather than command. As the night deepens further, it becomes easier to see Cleopatra not as an exception, but part of a continuum. Her strategies did not vanish with her reign. They resurfaced wherever formal authority was inaccessible, but influence was still required. In households, in clans, in marriages arranged to preserve bloodlines, in women who learned to guide outcomes from the margins where visibility was dangerous, but memory was safe. Cleopatra's life teaches a final, gentle lesson. Power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it settles into routines, into gestures passed quietly from one generation to the next. Sometimes it hides in patience, in timing, in the ability to wait. Cleopatra mastered this art not because she sought dominance, but because survival demanded subtlety. And subtlety, when practiced well, becomes its own form of strength. As we allow her presence to fade softly into the background, we do not lose her. We simply watch her dissolve into a broader story, one that continues long after names are forgotten. Across medieval landscapes, behind stone walls and within family halls, women carried forward the same quiet intelligence. They did not rule empires, but they ensured continuity. They did not command armies, but they shaped futures. And so, without hurry, Without disruption, the story turns from a queen who ruled through silence to countless women who governed through endurance, from the singular figure of Cleopatra to the shared, often invisible power of women within clans. The night remains calm, the rhythm remains slow, and history continues to speak, softly. They didn't sit on thrones. They didn't lead armies, yet entire bloodlines survived because of them. As the night carries us away from emperors and queens, it leads us into quieter halls, into medieval homes warmed by firelight, where history was not written, but remembered. Between the 12th and 16th centuries, Europe was shaped not only by kings and crusades, but by women whose power moved slowly, steadily, and almost invisibly through clans. In medieval society, power was dangerous when held openly by women. Laws, customs, and expectations confined authority to men, especially in public life. Yet life itself did not pause for these rules. Children were born, land needed managing, alliances needed preserving, and memory needed continuity. Into this space stepped women of the clans, not as rebels, but as caretakers of survival. A clan was more than a family. It was a living structure, vulnerable to war, famine, disease, and shifting loyalties. For a clan to endure, it needed more than swords. It needed memory. Women became the living archives of their people. They remembered lineage when records were lost. They recalled who owed loyalty to whom. They carried the stories that explained why certain alliances existed and why others must never be trusted again. Through them, identity remained intact even when borders shifted. Genealogy in this world was not a hobby, it was protection. Knowing one's bloodline determined inheritance, alliances, and legitimacy. Women preserved this knowledge orally, passing it from mother to daughter, aunt to niece. These recitations were not dramatic. They were woven into daily life, repeated during work, during meals, during long winter nights. In this repetition, history survived quietly. Marriage, often portrayed as a loss of agency for women, also became a subtle instrument of influence. A woman entering a new household carried with her the memory of another clan. She understood customs, expectations, and unspoken tensions. Through her, communication flowed where direct negotiation might have failed. Peace often lasted not because men agreed, but because women remembered what conflict cost. Within the household, women exercised authority through responsibility. While men traveled or fought, women managed land, distributed food, supervised labor, and negotiated with neighbors. These decisions were immediate and practical. They determined whether a family survived winter or fell into ruin. Though rarely acknowledged publicly, this form of power was absolute in its domain. What made this influence enduring was its continuity. Kings ruled for years, women shaped generations. Their authority did not depend on titles, but on trust earned through consistency. When crisis arrived, people listened to those who had guided them through previous hardships. This trust accumulated slowly, quietly, like sediment forming the foundation of a riverbank. As the night deepens, it becomes clear that these women were not exceptions. They formed a pattern repeated across regions and centuries. They governed without spectacle, ensuring that history did not fracture under the weight of constant change. Their power was not loud enough to provoke resistance, yet strong enough to sustain entire communities. History remembers kings, but history survives because of women who were never named. And as we rest in this understanding, the story prepares to move forward toward moments when power no longer whispered, but stepped into ritual and display. As the night grows heavier and the world outside becomes still, the true strength of medieval clan women reveals itself not through action, but through memory. In an age where written records were fragile, rare, and often lost to fire or war, survival depended on what could be remembered and passed on. Women became the vessels of this living history, carrying the past forward one quiet retelling at a time. Stories in medieval households were not entertainment alone. They were instruction. Around hearths and candlelight, women repeated accounts of old alliances, betrayals, migrations, and survival. These stories taught children who they were long before they learned to read. They explained why certain names were spoken with respect, why others were avoided, and why some paths were never taken again. Through repetition, memory became structure. This form of power was subtle but decisive. A clan that forgot its past was vulnerable. It could be manipulated, divided, or erased. Women ensured this did not happen. They remembered land boundaries when markers disappeared. They recalled obligations when promises were denied. In disputes, their memory often carried more authority than any document. What had been lived could not easily be dismissed. Voice in this context was not loud, it was steady. Women learned when to speak and when to remain silent. Silence protected knowledge. Speech released it only when necessary. This discipline kept families intact during extreme uncertainty. Words were chosen carefully because words shaped reality. Once spoken, they traveled. Once remembered, they endured. Rituals within the household reinforced this memory. Seasonal practices, burial customs, naming traditions, and daily routines anchored families to continuity. Women guided these rituals, ensuring they were performed correctly, not out of superstition, but out of identity. To forget a ritual was to loosen one's place in the world. To repeat it was to belong. Through these practices, women shaped moral frameworks as well. They taught what behavior was acceptable, what was shameful, and what must never be repeated. These lessons were rarely enforced by punishment. They were embedded in stories of consequence. Children learned restraint not from law, but from memory. This internal discipline was far more enduring than fear. Over generations, this quiet authority accumulated. Women who mastered memory became reference points within their communities. In moments of uncertainty, people sought their counsel, not because they held office, but because their knowledge spanned decades. They remembered famine and recovery, war and peace, loss and renewal. Their perspective extended beyond immediate emotion into long-term survival. This continuity created stability even when leadership changed violently. Kings died, lords fell, borders shifted, yet clans persisted because memory remained intact. Women ensured identity survived upheaval. Their influence did not challenge power directly, it outlasted it. As the night deepens, it becomes clear that this was not passive endurance, it was active preservation. Women of the clans curated history, deciding what to emphasize and what to let fade. This shaping of narrative guided future choices. Memory, carefully held, became strategy. In this way, medieval women governed time itself. They linked past to present, present to future. Their power was never recorded, yet without it, history would have fractured repeatedly. And so, while their names dissolved into anonymity, their work remained embedded in the fabric of society. This quiet governance prepared the world for moments when power would step into visibility again, when influence would no longer whisper through memory alone, but emerge in ritual, display, and performance. And it is toward that transformation that the story slowly moves next. As the night continues its slow descent, the world of medieval clans begins to shift almost imperceptibly. Power, which once survived best in silence, gradually learns to step closer to the light. This transition does not happen through conquest or proclamation. It happens through ritual, and at the heart of these rituals stand women, guiding the movement from private influence toward public form. Marriage in the medieval clan system was never a single event. It was a process unfolding over years, sometimes decades. Women understood this better than anyone. A wedding marked only the visible beginning. What followed was the careful weaving of households, loyalties, and expectations. Through daily conduct, women translated agreement into reality. Without this work, alliances collapsed quickly. With it, peace could last a generation. Rituals surrounding marriage reinforced this transformation. The exchange of gifts, shared meals, and repeated visits were not empty gestures. They were rehearsals of unity. Women oversaw these practices, ensuring that each detail communicated respect and balance. An incorrectly placed seat, a forgotten custom, a neglected courtesy could undo years of negotiation. Attention to these subtleties preserved harmony. Over time, these domestic rituals extended beyond the household. Feast days, religious observances, and seasonal gatherings became moments when influence could be seen, though still softly. Women coordinated these events, shaping how clans presented themselves to neighbors and rivals. What began as private continuity slowly evolved into collective display. This was not spectacle for its own sake, it was signaling. Through controlled visibility, clans communicated stability, generosity, and cohesion. Women ensured that these messages remained consistent. They knew that inconsistency bred doubt, and doubt invited challenge. Display, when carefully managed, protected what silence alone could no longer secure. In this way, women acted as translators between worlds. They carried the quiet knowledge of memory into rituals that others could witness. The private became public without becoming loud. Influence retained its subtlety even as it gained form. As centuries passed, this pattern intensified. Economic growth, urban centers, and courtly life expanded opportunities for display. Yet the foundational skills remained the same. Timing, restraint, and atmosphere mattered more than dominance. Women who mastered these elements shaped perception long before political power formalized it. By the late medieval period, the distinction between household ritual and public ceremony blurred. What had once occurred around hearths now unfolded in halls. Women adapted seamlessly, guiding this expansion without abandoning the principles that sustained it. Their influence did not vanish, it transformed. As the night deepens, we sense that history is preparing us for a new chapter. Power is no longer confined to memory alone. It is learning to be seen. And soon, in the courts of Italy, ritual will become theater, and influence will be performed in full view. But its roots remain here, in the patient work of women who taught power how to move gracefully into the light. As the night settles into its deepest quiet, the story of women within the clans reaches a gentle turning point. For centuries, power had survived best in silence, moving through memory, routine, and patient care. But the world was changing. Trade expanded, cities grew, courts emerged as centers of influence. And with these changes came a need for power to be recognized, not only felt. This was the moment when hidden authority began to learn how to appear without losing its soul. Women guided this transition with remarkable grace. They understood that visibility could be dangerous if rushed, yet necessary if ignored too long. The skills they had cultivated in private spaces became tools for public life. Hospitality, once practiced around hearths, expanded into formal receptions. Courtesy, once exchanged between families, became etiquette observed by entire courts. What had been intimate became ceremonial. At the center of this evolution stood women who knew how to shape atmosphere. They arranged gatherings where alliances were reinforced not by contracts, but by shared experience. They understood that food, seating, timing, and gesture could communicate stability more convincingly than words. These events were not displays of excess alone. They were performances of order. And order in unstable times was deeply reassuring. This shift did not erase the quiet forms of power that preceded it. Instead, it layered new expressions upon old foundations. Memory still mattered. Ritual still anchored identity. But now these elements were presented in ways others could witness. Influence gained shape, authority gained rhythm, and power, once hidden, began to be performed. Importantly, women did not relinquish control in this process. They curated the transition. They decided what aspects of private life could be revealed and which must remain protected. This discernment ensured continuity. Even as power stepped into view, it retained the patience and restraint that had sustained it for generations. By the late medieval period, this transformation was unmistakable. The domestic rituals of clans had evolved into public ceremonies of courts. Women who once managed households now shaped reputations. Their influence extended beyond bloodlines into politics, culture, and art. Yet their methods remained consistent: calm, measured, attentive to detail. As the night deepens further, we sense that history is ready to cross a threshold. Power is no longer content to whisper through memory alone. It is preparing to be seen, tasted and remembered by many at once. The stage is being set, the tables are being laid, and soon, in the glow of candlelit halls, influence will unfold as spectacle. The women of the clans made this possible. Without their patient stewardship, the rituals of the court would have lacked substance. Without their understanding of continuity, display would have been hollow. They ensured that when power emerged into the open, it carried meaning, not just shine. And so, as this chapter closes, the story turns smoothly, without rupture, from hearths to halls, from memory to ceremony, from influence felt in silence to authority expressed through ritual. The night remains calm, the pace remains slow, and history prepares to invite us into its next space, where power will no longer whisper, but perform. These banquets were not about food. They were about being seen and being remembered. As the night carries us from the quiet endurance of medieval clans into the candlelit halls of Renaissance Italy, power changes its posture. It no longer hides in memory alone. It takes a seat. It waits. It allows others to notice where it rests. In the courts of Italy, influence was no longer whispered through lineage. It was arranged, measured, and served. Italian courts during the Renaissance were worlds of calculated elegance. Every gesture mattered. Every glance carried meaning. And nowhere was this more carefully orchestrated than at the banquet table. These gatherings appeared indulgent on the surface, yet beneath the layers of silk, silver, and sound lay a precise language of hierarchy. To understand power in these courts, one did not listen to speeches. One watched where people sat. Seating was never accidental. Proximity to the host reflected favor, trust, and rising influence. A guest placed close to the center was being quietly elevated. Another, seated further away, was being reminded of their position. These arrangements spoke without confrontation. No announcement was necessary. Everyone understood the message. Power here did not shout. It simply placed chairs. Food itself carried political meaning. Dishes were selected not only for taste, but for symbolism. Rare ingredients suggested reach and wealth. Regional specialties acknowledged alliances. Exotic spices hinted at trade routes and influence beyond borders. Even the sequence of courses mattered. What arrived first signaled priority. What arrived last lingered in memory. Through these choices, hosts communicated stability, generosity, and control. Women played a crucial role in shaping these environments. Though men often occupied formal authority, women curated the atmosphere. They understood how light softened conversation, how music slowed tension, how pacing prevented excess. Their influence ensured that banquets did not descend into chaos. Order here was seductive. Guests left feeling included, indebted, or quietly repositioned. Conversation at these tables followed its own rhythm. Silence was not awkward, it was intentional. Pauses allowed reflection. Words were chosen carefully because words traveled. A remark overheard at dinner could shape alliances for years. Banquets functioned as testing grounds where loyalty was observed rather than declared. Who laughed? Who listened? Who remained calm? These details mattered. As the night deepens, the banquets of Italian courts reveal themselves not as celebrations, but as instruments. They created shared memory. To be invited was to be acknowledged. To be remembered from a banquet was to exist within the court's inner world. Exclusion, conversely, erased presence without conflict. Power here was not violent, it was selective. This environment rewarded restraint. Those who spoke too much diminished themselves. Those who listened appeared wise. Influence accumulated through composure. The table taught participants how to behave long after the meal ended. In this way, banquets extended their power beyond the hall, shaping conduct across the court. Power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it sets the table. And as we rest in this realization, the story prepares to move further, because some rulers were not content with ritual alone. They sought to make power permanent, not just remembered. And so, beyond the banquet halls, another form of authority begins to rise, one carved not in conversation, but in stone. As the evening stretches on and the candles burn lower, the banquet reveals its deeper function. What appears effortless is, in truth, carefully rehearsed. Every movement follows an invisible script. In the Italian courts of the Renaissance, banquets were not moments of rest from politics. They were politics slowed down, softened, and made beautiful enough to be accepted without resistance. Ritual governed these gatherings with precision. Guests arrived in sequence, not all at once, allowing anticipation to build. Music did not dominate the room. It hovered at the edge of hearing, guiding emotion without demanding attention. Servants moved in practiced patterns, never interrupting conversation, never drawing focus. The effect was subtle discipline. Everyone adjusted their behavior to the rhythm of the space. This rhythm trained the court. Over time, those who attended learned how to behave long before they were told. They learned when to speak, when to pause, and when silence carried more weight than words. The banquet became a classroom where power taught obedience without issuing commands. Compliance felt voluntary. That was its genius. Food arrived as ceremony rather than consumption. Courses unfolded slowly, allowing conversation to mature. Rich dishes were balanced by restraint, signaling abundance without excess. This balance mattered. Excess suggested instability. Restraint suggested control. Hosts communicated that their authority was measured, not desperate. In uncertain times, this reassurance was irresistible. Women again shaped these dynamics from within. They advised on pacing, atmosphere, and presentation. Their understanding of social currents ensured that banquets achieved their purpose. They knew when a guest needed attention and when distance conveyed respect. Their influence maintained harmony, preventing moments that might fracture alliances. Banquets also created hierarchy without confrontation. Favor could be granted quietly through invitation, placement, or conversation. Disfavor could be expressed just as gently, through absence or distance. No conflict erupted, no reputation was publicly damaged, yet everyone understood the shift. Power moved like a shadow, altering shape without noise. These gatherings extended their influence beyond the hall. Stories traveled. Being seen at a banquet became a marker of relevance. To be mentioned afterward was to exist within the court's memory. Those excluded faded without protest. In this way, banquets controlled not only behavior, but narrative. As the night deepens, we sense how effective this system was. Violence became unnecessary. Authority was internalized. People governed themselves according to expectations learned at the table. The banquet taught patience, restraint, and loyalty more effectively than fear ever could. Yet this refinement carried a cost. Power, once shaped by memory and ritual, now depended on constant performance. Visibility became necessary. Absence could mean erasure. Courts grew fragile, dependent on spectacle to sustain influence. This tension would eventually push rulers to seek permanence beyond ritual. As the candles dim further, the limits of performance become clear. Ritual can shape behavior, but it cannot withstand time alone. And so the story prepares to move again, beyond halls and tables, toward rulers who sought to anchor power in stone and earth, beyond memory and display. As the night drifts deeper and the banquet stretches into memory, another layer of meaning begins to surface. Beneath ritual and restraint, beneath seating and silence, there was something more fragile driving these displays. Fear. Not fear of enemies, but fear of disappearance. In the Italian courts, power learned that to survive, it had to be remembered. And memory, unlike stone, fades unless carefully reinforced. Luxury became the language through which courts tried to defeat time. Gold plates, embroidered fabrics, rare pigments, and fleeting performances were not indulgences alone. They were attempts to imprint presence onto memory. Guests were meant to leave not only satisfied, but marked. The banquet did not end when the food was cleared. It continued in recollection, in stories retold elsewhere, in comparisons whispered across other halls. Symbols carried this weight: a specific color worn by the host, a repeated motif carved into utensils, a theme echoed through music and decoration. These choices were deliberate. They created identity. Courts distinguished themselves not through law, but through atmosphere. To recall a banquet was to recall its ruler. In this way, authority extended beyond physical presence. Yet symbols are delicate. They require repetition. One banquet meant little. A pattern meant everything. Italian courts understood this deeply. They refined consistency across events, ensuring that guests experienced familiarity wrapped in novelty. The mind remembers what it recognizes. Through this technique, power became habitual. Women were central to this symbolic economy. They oversaw coherence, ensuring that colors, gestures, and moods aligned across occasions. Their sensitivity to continuity allowed spectacle to feel organic rather than forced. Without this guidance, luxury would have fragmented into excess. With it, display became narrative. As banquets grew more elaborate, they also revealed a growing anxiety. Power increasingly depended on being seen performing itself. Absence threatened relevance. Courts competed not only in wealth, but in memorability. Who hosted the most talked-about gathering? Who shaped taste? Who set the standard others followed? These competitions were silent but relentless. This pressure transformed banquets into rehearsals for permanence. Hosts experimented with scale, architecture, and symbolism, searching for forms that could outlast memory. Temporary displays began to hint at lasting ones. Decorative arches foreshadowed permanent monuments. Ritual gestures hinted at fixed traditions. The desire to endure moved beyond the table. As the night deepens further, we sense that banquets had reached their limit. They could shape behavior and memory, but only briefly. To truly defeat forgetting, power needed to anchor itself somewhere more resistant than human recall. The next step would not be eaten, heard, or seen for an evening. It would be built. In this realization, the Italian banquet becomes a turning point rather than an end point. It teaches us that ritual and luxury are steps in a longer journey, a journey toward permanence. toward authority carved into the world itself. And as the candles burn out and halls empty, the story prepares to leave behind performance, moving toward rulers who sought to make power immovable. As the night reaches its calmest hour, the banquet halls of Italy begin to empty, leaving behind only echoes and memory. The candles burn low, the music fades, and what remains is a quiet realization shared, though rarely spoken, by those who once ruled these rooms. Performance is powerful, but it is fleeting. Even the most carefully staged ritual dissolves when the guests depart. Power, they learned, could be remembered, but memory alone was fragile. Italian courts reached a moment of recognition. Ritual could guide behavior, luxury could shape taste, symbol could mark identity, yet none of these could stand against time without constant repetition. The banquet demanded renewal, another feast, another display, another evening spent persuading the world to remember. And this endless need revealed a vulnerability at the heart of spectacle. Rulers began to sense the limits of performance. To disappear from sight, even briefly, was to risk irrelevance. Influence tied to visibility required continuous presence. Courts that failed to impress faded quietly. Those that succeeded exhausted themselves maintaining attention. The table, once a tool of control, became a burden. This realization did not arrive suddenly. It unfolded slowly, like the night itself. Hosts noticed how guests remembered the setting more vividly than the conversation, how architecture lingered in memory longer than taste, how stone outlasted song. These observations planted a question that banquets could not answer. What if power could be made permanent? The answer lay beyond ritual, beyond the hall, beyond the table. If influence could be carved into the world itself, it would not need to be constantly performed. It could simply exist. This idea marked a turning point in how authority imagined its future. As the night deepens, we feel the story preparing to leave Italy's courts behind, not because they failed, but because they revealed what came next. The banquet taught rulers how to be seen. Now they sought to be unmovable. Performance gave way to construction. Memory gave way to monument. This transition carries us eastward, across centuries and cultures, toward a ruler who did not rely on ritual or persuasion, a ruler who sought to make power undeniable, not through invitation, but through scale, through labor, through stone and earth shaped into permanence. The banquet, with all its refinement, becomes the final rehearsal before something far more absolute. Where Italian courts whispered power through etiquette, another empire would engrave it across landscapes. And so, as the last echoes of laughter fade, the night invites us onward, toward walls that were not meant to be remembered for an evening, but for millennia. This wall was not just stone. It was a message written across the land. As the night settles into its deepest stillness, we leave behind whispers, rituals, and performances, and arrive at something heavier, slower, and more permanent. Here, power no longer needs an audience. It no longer asks to be remembered. It becomes the horizon itself. Under Qi Shi Huang, the world's first emperor of a unified China, authority took a form that could not be ignored, not because it spoke, but because it endured. Before this moment, power had moved through people, through voices carefully lowered, through traditions guarded by families, through banquets that taught restraint and memory. But Qi Shi Huang ruled in an age that demanded certainty. Fragmentation had exhausted the land. Rival states had worn the population thin. To unify was not enough. Unity had to be visible, undeniable, and impossible to forget. The Great Wall, as it began to take shape, was not conceived merely as defense. It was a declaration stretched across mountains and valleys. It marked where the empire ended and where it began. To stand before it was to understand scale, not the scale of ambition alone, but the scale of time. This was power measured not in moments, but in lifetimes. Construction did not happen in a single act. It unfolded slowly, relentlessly, across seasons. Laborers arrived in silence. Soldiers watched. Engineers measured. Earth was moved by hand. Stone followed the curve of the land. Each segment absorbed human effort until the boundary itself seemed to breathe with it. Sweat became mortar. Time became structure. This labor was not meant to be celebrated. There were no banquets here, no music to soften the work. The silence was part of the message. Authority did not persuade, it commanded, and obedience was written into the landscape. The wall taught its lesson without words. It simply existed, day after day, indifferent to comfort or complaint. As the night deepens, it becomes clear that the wall's true power lay in its inevitability. One could argue with a ruler, one could resist a law, but one could not negotiate with a mountain of stone stretching beyond sight. The wall did not need to move. It required everyone else to adapt around it. This is the moment when power reaches its peak, when it becomes environment rather than action. In this form, authority no longer depends on memory alone. It does not risk fading with time. Instead, it anchors time. Generations grow up with it as part of their world. Children learn boundaries not from stories, but from horizons. The empire does not announce itself, it is simply there. As we rest within this realization, the wall begins to feel less like an object and more like a presence. It watches without eyes, it speaks without voice, it holds the quiet weight of countless lives compressed into stone and earth. This is power at rest, power that no longer needs to perform because it has become the stage upon which life unfolds. And as the night carries us onward, we sense that the journey of power has reached its final form. From whispers to silence, from ritual to spectacle, and now to permanence. The wall does not sleep, it does not listen, it remains. And in remaining, it completes the story we have followed, from the softest breath of influence to the heaviest mark upon the land. As the night settles further and the world seems to slow its breathing, attention shifts away from the wall itself and toward the lives absorbed into it. Great structures often distract us from the hands that built them. Yet here, in the quiet presence of the wall, those hands become impossible to ignore. Qin Shi Huang's authority was not expressed only through stone, but through the collective surrender of countless lives to a single purpose. The laborers who built the wall did not arrive as individuals with stories recorded in history. They came as bodies counted, assigned, and replaced. Farmers, prisoners, conscripts, and soldiers were gathered from across the newly unified empire. Their names faded quickly. Their effort remained. This was power translated into labor, and labor translated into landscape. Silence defined their experience. Orders were given, but rarely explained. There was no ceremony to mark beginnings or endings. Each day followed the last with relentless similarity. Earth was lifted, stones were carried, mortar was mixed, and when exhaustion overcame a body, another took its place. The wall did not pause. It absorbed time without acknowledgement. In this silence, authority achieved a different kind of completeness. It did not negotiate loyalty, it required submission. The absence of dialogue was intentional. Explanation invites doubt. Doubt weakens command. By removing conversation, power simplified itself. It became mechanical, impersonal, and therefore unchallenged. As the night deepens, it becomes clear that the wall functioned as a lesson in inevitability. Those who labored upon it learned that resistance was not answered with argument, it was answered with continuation. The work simply went on. This continuity taught obedience more effectively than punishment alone. When effort feels endless, questioning feels pointless. Yet within this vast silence, human presence still lingered. Footprints in the dust, calloused hands, breaths synchronized with labor. These traces never formed narratives, yet they shaped the wall's texture. The structure carries within it the rhythm of bodies that moved in unison, not by choice, but by command. The wall thus became a record not of individual achievement, but of collective endurance. It erased difference. It flattened identity. Everyone became part of the same line, moving forward at the same pace. Power here did not elevate, it consumed. This consumption extended beyond construction. Communities reorganized themselves around the wall's demands. Fields were left unattended. Families adapted to absence. Time was redirected toward permanence rather than prosperity. The empire asked for sacrifice, not once, but continuously. And the wall stood as proof that sacrifice had been given. As we rest within this realization, the wall's meaning deepens. It is no longer only a symbol of imperial ambition, it is a quiet monument to obedience. Not obedience born of belief, but obedience enforced by scale and repetition. In this way, the wall reshaped not only the land, but the people who lived beside it. The night invites us to sit with this weight, not to judge, but to understand. Power, at its most absolute, does not need to speak. It does not need to persuade. It arranges reality until compliance feels natural. And when power becomes landscape, resistance becomes geography. As the night continues its slow descent, the wall begins to shift in meaning once more. Beyond labor and obedience, beyond stone and silence, it reshapes something even more enduring, the way people think. Boundaries had always existed before Qin Shi Huang. Rivers, mountains, and traditions separated communities. But these borders were negotiable. They shifted with seasons, treaties, and memory. The wall changed that. It made division absolute. For those who lived near it, the wall was not simply a structure. It became a constant presence in daily thought. It told people where the world stopped. It framed imagination. To grow up beside it was to inherit a sense of permanence. Children learned early that some things did not move, did not listen, did not change. Authority no longer needed explanation. It had shape. Time itself bent around the wall. Projects measured in days or years gave way to efforts spanning generations. No single person could witness its completion. This was intentional. Power was no longer human-scaled. It exceeded lifespans. In doing so, it diminished the importance of individual will. What mattered was continuity, not choice. The wall also altered fear. Threats no longer felt personal. They became abstract, distant, managed by stone rather than by people. Defense was no longer an action, but a condition. The empire did not respond to danger, it preempted it. This created an illusion of safety rooted in permanence, and permanence, when accepted, quiets anxiety. Yet this psychological comfort carried its own cost. When security is embedded into landscape, vigilance fades. Responsibility shifts away from individuals toward structures. The wall promised protection without participation. Obedience replaced engagement. Power in becoming environment reduced the need for loyalty. It required only acceptance. As the night deepens, the wall begins to resemble something more than imperial policy. It becomes a philosophy made physical, a belief that order must be fixed, not negotiated, that stability requires immobility, that the world functions best when boundaries are unquestioned. This worldview would echo long after Qin Shi Huang's reign ended. Even centuries later, as dynasties rose and fell, the wall remained, repaired, extended, abandoned, rediscovered. Each generation interpreted it differently, yet none could ignore it. The wall outlived intention. It outlasted ideology. It became history without needing narration. In this way, the wall achieved what rituals and banquets could not. It removed the need for memory. People did not have to recall the empire's power. They walked beside it. They touched it. They planned their lives around it. Power no longer depended on story. It became fact. As we rest in this understanding, the journey of authority feels complete. From whispered influence to silent endurance. From ritual performance to monumental certainty. Power no longer moves. It settles. It waits. It shapes thought itself. And in the stillness of the night, the wall stands as a reminder that the ultimate expression of power is not command, nor spectacle, nor even obedience. It is permanence, the ability to exist beyond question, beyond debate, beyond time. As the night deepens into its quietest hour, the presence of the wall changes once more. Not in shape, not in scale, but in how it relates to the people who live beside it. Over time, voices fade, generations pass. Those who built the wall are no longer remembered as individuals. Their names dissolve, their stories fragment. What remains is not memory in the human sense, but something colder and more durable, structure. This is the final transformation of power, when authority no longer needs witnesses, when it no longer depends on loyalty, belief, or fear, when it no longer listens. The wall does not remember the laborers. It does not recall suffering. It does not preserve intention. It stands without context. And in doing so, it reshapes how history itself is experienced. For the people who came after, the wall was not a project. It was a given. It had always been there. Children learned its presence before they learned its purpose. It framed their understanding of the world long before they asked questions about why it existed. Power no longer entered consciousness as command, it entered as assumption. This shift marks the disappearance of the individual voice. When power becomes landscape, dissent loses its language. One cannot argue with geography. One cannot debate stone. The wall does not respond, it absorbs. And so resistance transforms into adaptation. People adjust their lives, routes, and expectations around what cannot be moved. Memory changes shape here. It no longer lives in stories passed down by elders. It lives in paths worn into the earth, in villages positioned in relation to the wall, in habits shaped by its shadow. History becomes spatial rather than verbal. It is learned by walking, not by listening. As the night continues, we feel how profoundly this alters human experience. Identity becomes local rather than narrative. Belonging is defined by proximity, not lineage. The wall decides who is inside and who is outside without explanation. This silent categorization feels natural because it never speaks. Over centuries, the wall witnesses change without participating. Empires fall, dynasties replace one another, languages shift, beliefs evolve, yet the wall remains. It does not adapt, it does not reinterpret itself, it simply persists. And in persisting, it teaches a lesson more powerful than any law, that permanence outlives intention. In this quiet endurance, power achieves its most impersonal form. It no longer needs to justify itself. It does not seek understanding. It becomes background. And background, when constant, becomes unquestioned truth. As we rest within this realization, the journey that began with whispers and rituals feels almost distant. Cleopatra's careful timing, the clan women's silent memory, the Italian court's measured spectacle, all required attention, all required participation. The wall does not. It waits. The evening invites us to recognize what has been lost in this transformation. The warmth of human voice, the nuance of story, the possibility of change through dialogue. Yet it also shows us why rulers sought this form of power, because it does not fade, it does not argue, it does not sleep. And so, as the world grows quiet, the wall stands not as a triumph, but as a conclusion, the place where power stops moving, stops speaking, and simply remains. As the night reaches its deepest stillness, everything we have witnessed begins to settle into a single, quiet understanding. Power, when stripped of noise, reveals a pattern. It does not always arrive with force. It does not always announce itself. Often it moves softly, patiently, shaping the world while appearing to do very little at all. Cleopatra understood this. She did not rush, she waited. She chose moments instead of battles. Her power lived in timing, in atmosphere, in the subtle control of attention. She ruled not by overwhelming the room, but by changing how the room felt. Even now, her influence lingers not because of conquest, but because of precision. Centuries later, women of the clans carried a different form of power. They held no crowns, they commanded no armies, yet they preserved continuity when everything else threatened to break apart. Their strength lived in memory, in lineage, in the quiet decisions that shaped generations. They did not shape history by standing at its center, but by preventing it from unraveling. In the courts of Renaissance Italy, power learned to perform. It dressed itself in ritual and spectacle. It spoke through seating arrangements and measured glances. There, authority became visible, theatrical, carefully staged. Yet even in these banquets, power depended on understanding silence, on knowing when not to speak, on letting presence do the work. And finally, under Qin Shi Huang, power reached its most complete form. It stopped moving, it stopped explaining, it became stone. The wall did not persuade, it did not perform, it did not remember, it simply existed. In doing so, it outlived every voice that created it. From whisper to memory to ritual to permanence, power completed its journey. Each stage required less sound, less explanation, less humanity, until at last it needed nothing at all. And this is where the night brings us, to a place where history no longer feels loud or distant, but slow and close. Where power is not something shouted across time, but something we feel in the background of the world we live in borders, in habits, in assumptions we rarely question. As you rest now, allow these stories to fade gently, not into meaning, but into calm. Cleopatra's silence, the clan women's endurance, the banquet's measured ritual, the wall's unbroken line. They do not ask to be remembered, they only ask to be felt. Because when the world grows quiet, this is how power truly moves, not in moments of noise, but in what remains when everything else falls asleep. And now, let the night take over. History has finished speaking. The stones are still. The stories have settled. And you are safe to drift, slowly, peacefully, into rest.